Welcome back, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. This week on the podcast, I was joined by Michael Evans to talk about carbon management in the aviation sector. Michael is the Sustainability Insights Manager for the International Airline Group. And as part of our discussion this week, we discussed how IAG is tackling CORSIA, their compliance obligations in all the different carbon markets that they operated in, and the use of sustainable aviation fuel as part of the group's carbon management planning and their path to net zero. If you enjoy our conversation, please like the podcast. And if you want to stay on top of all upcoming episodes, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with Michael. Hi, and Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining Navigating Carbon today. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thanks for having me, Deb. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's great to see you. And we're going to talk about all things aviation today. I'm really excited to dive in. And just to kind of start us off, I thought, like, can you give the audience an overview of like who IAG is and what your role is at IAG?
Sure. So IAG or International Airlines Group, we're European-based, Spanish-based to be specific, and we've got 5 airlines in the group. We're commonly known by our airlines, so we're made up of British Airways, Iberia, Vueling, Aer Lingus, and our carrier across the transatlantic routes called Level. We also have non-airline businesses covering IAG Loyalty, IAG Cargo, and we have a general business unit as well, all involved in helping support the whole range of kind of services you'd expect for a sort of tour operator, airline group such as ours. So our primary markets obviously are European focused. We have hubs in key European destinations like London, Dublin, Madrid, and Barcelona. And we obviously offer services around the world. All the different airlines have slightly different markets, but of course, sustainability is what we own as IAG Group, and we have a consistent sort of sustainability strategy to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. And that is our kind of core goal, and that will be delivered through everybody in the group, including me.
Very cool. And I think we'll pull apart and dive into kind of like pieces of that strategy through this conversation, which I think it'd be really great for the audience to understand. Because for airlines, in particular, like there's so many different sort of pieces that go along with the decarbonization and net zero strategies with this. And I wanted to start with CORSIA. For the folks that aren't aware, CORSIA is and let me get this right, there's so many acronyms, but the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation.
Spot on.
Excellent. CORSIA, which is managed by ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. I think that's correct as well. So many
Also
acronyms.
correct.
So can you give folks an overview of like what CORSIA is, and how you guys have to think about complying with that?
Sure. So CORSIA is kind of the first kind of carbon market of its type. It's the only carbon market that's currently designed in the world that applies to a specific sector and operates at a global level. It works essentially by using carbon offsets. So the concept is that emissions above a baseline are compensated through the use of paying for carbon offsets. And originally, CORSIA was designed to achieve ICAO's goal, which was to limit or to maintain carbon neutral growth, originally above the average of 2019-2020 emissions. As people may be aware, obviously COVID had a huge impact on the aviation sector and actually changed the amount of flying that was able to be done around the world. So since 2021, essentially, the ICAO governance agreed that only 2019 would be used as that baseline setting year. And from 2024, so running from this year for the first phase of the scheme, that baseline actually is now set at 85% of those 2019 levels. And so the theory is that they run on essentially kind of a 3-year kind of monitoring period. So we are accruing emissions for 2024, 2025, 2026, for example. We have then 2027 to give the final verified emission report to our national administrator, who will in turn give that to ICAO. And then, of course, by January 2028, we will be expected to retire credits that cover the emissions from that 3-year period. So the total compliance window is quite long. It's about 4 and a bit years or so, but the actual monitoring period is done on an annual basis, but it applies to 3-year kind of emission cycles.
And you talked about specifically this phase one piece. I know, I know there was like a pilot period that was sort of happening. Like you said, some of this sort of started to happen in that 2019, 2020 period. Can you talk about like, we've seen some recent announcements around what like the supply of phase one credits and what the certification and availability of those might look like. Can you kind of talk about some of the challenges we've seen in that space with the difference between the pilot credits versus the phase one credits and kind of how you've had to manage that?
Yeah, so there's a set of requirements on what sorts of credits we can buy as airlines to use towards our compliance offsetting obligations. The scheme obviously hasn't been running from 2024. It's been running technically since 2021, where there was a pilot phase that applied to 2021 to 2023 emissions. But because of the COVID pandemic, the airline community didn't generate essentially an obligation through that period, i.e., the emissions from total aviation were not above the levels of the baseline that was set. And obviously, what that means is that then, when applied to an individual operator such as us, there's essentially a multiplication of zero being done on the growth factor for the sector as a whole. This year, and obviously as we expect for the first phase, that will start to change as now airline activity levels recover. And essentially, the requirements on what sort of offsets we're able to buy, the critical kind of criteria is that firstly they must be from a CORSIA certified registry. So there are currently only a few of those available, and they go through an approval process with ICAO's technical advisory body known as the TAB, who approve the list of available, effectively registries, marketplaces to buy these credits from. Once we're able to get a credit from that marketplace, the credit itself has to meet minimum criteria set again by the CORSIA eligible unit criteria, also agreed and identified by the tab. So essentially, what that means is that the credit has to have a vintage year, i.e., the year in which the kind of emissions unit was kind of created. That can't be older than 2016 for the current phase. So we're obviously now in a period where the theory is that as the years kind of progress and the phases of CORSIA move forward, you're still using kind of credits from a relatively recent history, which allows the quality of those credits to be maintained. Of course, the key criteria that differentiates that pilot phase from the current phase that I've talked about is around the role of what's called the corresponding adjustment. So in the current phase, credits must come with what's called a letter of authorization from the host government. Essentially, what that means is that the government is not using that same credit for emission reductions that go towards its nationally determined contribution, its NDC. That means it's kind of freeing up those credits for sale on our market and for use by us as airline operators towards our compliance obligations. There are obviously other kind of criteria that obviously dictate kind of where and obviously when the credits themselves should be used. But they're the kind of two key ones, which is essentially governing kind of at what point we are able to kind of engage with certain projects in the market, what marketplaces we can buy from, and then of course making sure that all of those projects are not being double counted under another government's inventory.
Yeah, which makes sense. And that really having that corresponding adjustment sort of check mark essentially or documentation as you talked about, it has been it's taken a little while then. Like I said, there was some recent news about like which registries are now approved for those phase one credits. Can you explain which ones are actually already approved for folks and why that was such a big deal for these phase one credits going forward?
Sure. So up to now, I think from the start of the year, the tab operates in sort of cycles where it obviously takes applications from eligible registries and does a review process. So at the start of the year, around February, it was able to confirm that at least there was the first sort of two registries available to airline operators to buy credits from. That was essentially the Archery's registry was the more kind of prominent of the two that were accepted, sorry. And the reason for that is because that was the only kind of registry at the time that actually had some supply that we were aware of going through
Okay.
that registry for use. So there's a Red Plus credit that's available from a project based in Guyana that is now actually currently out there on the market for airlines to buy. It's been two for quite a long time. and essentially there were a whole host of other registries that had applied into the earlier TAB decision earlier this year, but were not accepted or were not approved. They were conditionally approved pending further work set by the TAB to come back to for future decision. That then meant that the key registries, or the key in my view, are the ones that obviously have the largest majority of credits that will go through them. So that particularly relates to the likes of Gold Standard and Vera, who I think across the VCM own more than at least 80–90% of the total amounts of credits that are traded on today's market. Those registries had applied. They had some conditional criteria that they went back and obviously provided more evidence into what was then known as the kind of October-November decision period. And by the end of November, we were able to at least hear from the registries that they have been now formally approved. We are still technically waiting, I think, even as of today, although I do have to keep refreshing my screen quite regularly. That the ICAO tab themselves haven't formally announced the
Okay.
full current list. So we are trusting the registries who have made those announcements themselves that they have got the approvals. But I think the market generally accepts that to be exactly the case. And I think it's just a case of paperwork getting out from the ICAO side that will confirm it for everybody
Okay.
else.
And yeah, having that increased supply there, even though, like you said, it's a very long compliance period and stuff like that, but having that supply of phase one credits, because I don't think people are very aware, but the volume of CORSIA eligible credits compared to the whole carbon market, it's actually often quite small. So having that supply that's available on those registries is quite important for airlines like yourselves and stuff like that. So
Yeah,
yeah. So
absolutely.
so one of the other things that's come up, so that's kind of the credit side of this, but there's been I saw an article recently that it was talking about airlines being a little bit more concerned about their compliance obligations under not just ICAO, but under their, emissions trading schemes and their compliance carbon market schemes, depending on where they operate. One of the things for you guys, you're based in the EU, but you're flying obviously internationally and stuff. So the ICAO piece covers the international piece, but for any of your domestic travel, you're governed by emissions trading schemes. So can you just talk about some of that kind of like balance that you're having to look at between your domestic and your international travel?
Yeah, of course. So we're not strangers to carbon pricing in the company and certainly in
Yeah.
Europe. Aviation's been part of the EU ETS since 2012. And at the time, obviously, that included also the UK. Since then, we've obviously now got a UK emissions trading scheme that operates in addition to the EU's emissions trading system, both of which cover aviation and obviously apply broadly to the same overall coverage through kind of bilateral treaties, but of course aren't currently subject to the same carbon price. And then, of course, we now have the CORSIA and the role that the CORSIA will play, which in our view is there to cover certainly long haul travel in the group. All of our transatlantic routes, for example, will be subject to CORSIA offsetting obligations, we expect, and essentially that will apply obviously to any international flight between participating ICAO CORSIA states. So, and there are more than 120 of those currently signed up for this current phase, close to 130, I think, of last count. So,
Mm.
essentially, when doing kind of that financial planning, it's extremely difficult at the moment because we have deployable assets in the aircraft that we operate. Obviously, what we have been doing for several years now is we obviously monitor the emissions from our flights on a flight by flight basis.
Well,
That obviously means that we can attribute the emissions, the costs, essentially to every individual route, every individual sort of route pair. Most airlines take that approach, and of course we have to do that because that forms part of our emissions monitoring plan for the compliance schemes that we're regulated by. But from a sort of challenge perspective, it is, yeah, no secret that there's been a lot of regulatory reform in the European carbon markets, both the UK and the EU. In both markets, by 2026, we will have no issuance of what's called free allocation, where we were previously given emission allowances by governments for free. They're being taken away. In return, essentially under the EU scheme, there's now a complementary incentive to incentivize the use of sustainable aviation fuel in Europe. And what that will enable us to do is it's being accompanied by what's called a kind of SAF allowances program, which essentially means that airline operators such as us will be able to claim for those emission allowances to come from the government, essentially to help cover the cost differential between the jet fossil fuel price and the additional price we're paying as airlines to use that sustainable aviation fuel. That's obviously a scheme that we welcome really strongly because it almost moves the theory from what's called kind of free allocation today to what I would call kind of more competitive allocation,
Hmm.
and it
Okay.
helps scale a whole new industry. It helps put money into the sustainable aviation fuels market where it's desperately needed if we're able to deliver any of the volumes that are now set through the EU's mandate. In the UK, it's a similar sort of story in terms of the government is working hard to implement policies that will help scale up the supply of SAF, but we're yet to currently see a significant amount of demand side policy that will help
Okay.
us use it. And so we're continually calling on the government to try and support the use of us trying to take on as much SAF as we possibly can. I guess the one thing that's good in both markets is that they're effectively called zero rated. So what that means is that by using SAF in our operations, we are not generating an emissions obligation under those markets. They're essentially creating a zero obligation there. That's slightly different to what CORSIA has, because the way
Mm.
CORSIA works is it reflects the life cycle emissions of the fuel. So if the life cycle reduction of producing sustainable aviation fuel is, for argument's sake, 85%, which conventionally that typically is around where SAFs today are based, certainly on the biofuel side, then under CORSIA we would still have an obligation to sort of top up that effective 15% with carbon credits. So when you put it all together, the economics of how we deploy SAF, how we kind of use carbon market pricing in our financial planning, it's a massively complicated
Yeah.
exercise. It's got a huge amount of potential duplicity. When you look at a single route, for example, now may be subject to more than one scheme. So we've got a huge amount of thinking to do, and obviously all we can ask is that, over time, the theory of having a globally recognized sort of market of what Corsair represents can help find some ways to help simplify some of our emissions reporting and our carbon pricing burdens going
Yeah.
forwards.
Let's jump back to the SAF conversation for a sec there, because I think for a lot of people, they might not be aware of kind of like some of this stuff, because it's, the sustainable aviation fuel under CORSIA, like you said, people have to account for the life cycle, and there's different, what people call different generations of types of SAF. I think a lot of people might not be aware that not all sustainable aviation fuel is the same. Can you explain, what you're having to think about in terms of what is a generation one, a generation two, a generation three SAF fuel, essentially, or fuel? Saying SAF fuel is obsolete, Deb. The F is fuel, but like when you're looking at your different sustainable aviation fuel options, can you outline what that Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3 kind of looks like for folks?
Yeah, sure. So SAF is obviously a new and emerging part of kind of a new market essentially in
Mm.
terms of how it's now being traded, but certainly in terms of what it is. Essentially, it reflects the fact that emissions that would otherwise be produced from continually burning fossil fuels to generate our jet kerosene that we use to run our aircraft that same carbon can be almost recycled from other places and essentially then redeveloped into a fuel, and that's what we obviously then can put in our aircraft. And in doing so, the more SAF that we use, essentially the more fossil fuels we'll need to extract in order to produce the same amount of fuel. Now, there are some limitations currently in terms of how much SAF we can blend into
Mm.
the aircraft for
Okay.
safety reasons. Currently, that's limited to 50%. So we are obviously doing a lot of flight trials, of which there have now been a huge number of flight trials just this year, really, testing both transatlantic routes, running individual aircrafts on a 100% blend of SAF. And as for the different types, you start with what's kind of the more abundant source. That's generally called the heifer SAF. It's essentially the biofuels based SAF, the crop based SAF, the likes of used cooking oil, etc. That's probably the most abundant source where the calorific value of that oil can be reprocessed and turned into a sustainable aviation fuel, and that can obviously be blended, sorry, into the conventional jet fuel pool as well. So you
Yeah.
don't have to create new engines, you don't have to run entirely new infrastructure. You can simply drop it into the existing fuel and run it into your aircraft. We then have sort of the second generation, the sort of third generation SAFs. These are the sort of SAFs that essentially rely more on what we call kind of a power to liquid process to generate the fuel itself. In most cases, they rely on the use of things like hydrogen, essentially a green energy source, an electricity source that can then obviously capture carbon and obviously turn that into the fuel. Now, the abundance of those sources are far more remote. The technological power and the energy required to produce those SAFs is far greater than the conventional sort of 1G heifer that we use. So what you'll see is that in terms of the policy space, the SAF mandates, which they're now known as, and of which there are many emerging around the world, they're generally looking at both two different facets. The first is that they look at an absolute volume for just getting total amount of SAF up as a use around the world. And obviously, by doing that, they're essentially imposing on generally the fuel producers an obligation to produce that fuel to a certain percentage of the total fuel mix. Obviously, we take on a large share of the burden for that because of course if we don't buy that fuel then the producer has no incentive to
Yeah.
make that fuel. So obviously whatever sort of targets adopted as a SAF mandate, the airline community generally also sees it for one in its own to some extent. What we then have is the second facet is around how that fuel mix is essentially derived. So what you'll see is in the EU, for example, in 2030, where there's a 6% mandate on the amount of SAF that should be used. 1.2% of that is from the higher generation, the second generation SAF, the
Okay.
PTL SAF. So the theory is that obviously using heifer for now, there's a reasonably good feedstock of global heifer supply today. And we think that that will roughly last us until around the 2030 period, but not a huge amount after.
Okay.
But what we need is the second generation SAF, which offers a higher life cycle emissions reduction compared to that kind of biofuel. So essentially, the idea is that the mandates not only increase the volume, but they also kind of move the market towards what we would call the kind of higher quality SAFs. Probably a bit similar in a way to comparing to the CORSIA market in that the vintage year and the types of credits that are eligible will move the dial from what's probably conventionally an offset to more of a removal, a carbon removal in the future.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it really brings into account, like with what you're talking about with Corsia requiring that life cycle, whether it's from grains or from some other power to liquids kind of process, having that carbon intensity for that fuel kind of calculated so that then you can include that as part of your emissions calculations as you're burning it and some of that kind of stuff, versus in your domestic flights where it's allowed to be a zero emissions number, that sort of strategy and balance for the airline in terms of what the emissions number is, but then what that carbon price is and stuff like that. It's a real balance and a real push and pull that you're having to play constantly from what you're talking about in terms of really kind of like optimizing costs at the end of the day. So
Yeah,
yeah,
fuel is critical to airlines.
yeah,
Obviously, without fuel, we can't fly, and more
yeah,
importantly, the cost of the fuel bill generally makes up a very large share of the operating cost for each airline group. So if we can make the fuel firstly sustainable, then we see it as being a massive step on our pathway to a net zero consistent world. And obviously in the IAG kind of roadmap, we essentially have a target where we expect around 70% of our total fuel in 2050 to be SAF, and that
yeah,
will give us roughly around a 40% emission reduction in 2050 compared to just using conventional fossil fuel jet. Of course, that means that we then have to complement that effort with other strategies to get us to that 100% reduction. So, of course, that goes alongside operating the aircraft as efficiently as we can, investing in new aircraft and fleet renewal, and obviously developing potentially new aircraft technologies themselves. So, there are ongoing developments to trial hydrogen aircraft or hydrogen powered aircraft. and look at electric aircraft as well for sort of some of the shorter hops and sort of shorter routes that we offer. And then, of course, there's still going to be a residual footprint. So that's where the role of carbon markets is critical. And in 2050, it roughly accounts for nearly 20% or so of our kind of total emission reductions will come through the use of what we expect to be carbon removals. And we've got a strategy only to use carbon removals in 2050 to cover that residual footprint. And the theory and the hope is that by that point, of course, the maturity of the carbon markets will allow us to do that at a cost basis that is essentially a fair cost and a cost that is a cost that we can pay.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So Michael, this has been great because I think this whole balance of like the aviation sector has been really coming, when we look at it as a whole, these challenges and the balance of emissions obligations versus carbon price and how that works into corporate strategy is such a fascinating conversation to me. So I really appreciate your time today. So, you sort of talked a little bit about like simplification of like some of the reporting and things like that, but what do you really see as sort of some of the next things, or what's kind of next in this space, do you think, before we kind of wrap up?
I think if I was to go by, I guess, a couple of points maybe on. So we hope CORSIA, for example, is a mechanism that will work. And of course, we're still kind of early days in deciding whether we think that that's going to be a fit for purpose tool, simply because it's a market that's been created essentially bottom up. So right now there isn't a huge amount of supply, and yet we sort of have a good sense of how much demand we think there will need to be for this first phase. But we don't feel particularly alarmed by that at this point
Okay.
in time. We have trust in the ICAO process that more credits will come to the market, more registries will be approved by the tab. And of course, we're now waiting for that national implementation. At the end of the day, CORSIA will be a nationally implemented mechanism. It's been designed at that global level, but it's down to the individual states to put those regulations in place. In Europe, we think we're quite a long way ahead, to be fair, in terms of that progress. We already have the monitoring regimes in place. I'm aware that there are a couple of states around the world that have already started to put in sort of the offsetting obligation, which is the next kind of big piece of legislation we'll be kind of keeping an eye out for. Um, so of course that hopefully gives us the starting point for what will be, a successful global carbon market, the first of its kind of type. And then I think, of course, all we can ask is that we're continuing to work hard to scale up SAF supply, scale up carbon removals, and look at the carbon removals market and the role that that plays. We recently contributed to the UK's consultation on including carbon
Okay.
removals in its emissions trading scheme. And so we're really supportive of all these sorts of initiatives that will help kind of increase the ability to put the business case together, to make our investments in these things even bigger, to get them to work earlier, and then of course to hopefully deliver on that roadmap that I mentioned and getting us to net zero by 2050.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time today. It was really great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Deb.